In this video, I'm going to walk through the process of setting up a very simple and very basic blueprint that essentially could be viewed as a prefab if you're an artist to be able to apply a single material that'll apply to several meshes, as well as expose some parameters for different lighting, coloration, and intensity. So that way it's easy for you to just drag this blueprint into your scene, add a simple material, add a couple tweaks without a lot of overcomplication or clutter. So let's get started. So in my scene, I've got a few various different meshes and some lights that I want to use as kind of my template to test multiple different materials and different setups. But what I want to do is I want to encapsulate this in something that's much easier for me to just drag into a scene and apply a material to that will apply it to everything. So that's the process we're going to do throughout this. So I'll show you just the various different components. So I have just kind of a mesh here with some draped cloth. I've got a couple different backdrop pieces, just a couple default spheres. And then a couple of these like light bars with a couple lights in it. So I've got one, and both of these lights actually have the exact same settings to them, with the exception of their color temperature. So they've got about the same intensity, attenuation radius, fall off, etc. So this is our cool one, and then this is kind of our warm one. So that's it. Now, I could add all these to my scene. I could group them, but if I wanted to apply a single material to, say, you know, the backdrop, the cloth, to the spheres as well, I'd have to manually go through each one, select it, and add it to a material. So not necessarily a laborious process, but it's definitely very cumbersome and lengthy if I have to do this over and over again. So to help me with this process, I'm actually going to convert this to a blueprint and put just a little bit of simple logic in there that allows me just to assign a single material, and it assigns it to everything. So now that we have our assets in our scene, let's go ahead and convert this over to our blueprint. So I'm just going to select everything that's in here, and I'm going to, there's a couple ways we can do it. We can right click and replace it, or we can go up into this blueprints, and I can do convert selected components into a blueprint class. So I'm going to go ahead and save it under here, our diorama blueprints, and I'm going to call this my diorama BP. And I'll go ahead and create a blueprint, and there we go. And if we open it, we'll see what we have here. So it's automatically been converted into our scene. So now we've got this blueprint. You can see that our assets are actually gone now. And then this is our general setup of our blueprint. So there's our individual assets, which we can see in the viewport. And that's great. So we have all our lights in there with all of our settings, and that's perfect. So let's go ahead and compile and save. Now that we have our blueprint, let's go in and actually put a little bit of logic into it to make it workable. So when we drag this in, we can change different things and make it more simplified. So let's go ahead and start that process. So before we jump in and change our blueprint, one of the things that I want to show is why this is nice to set this up as a blueprint versus having all the individual assets. I can simply go down to my blueprint, drag this into my scene, and I've got all my components. So it's one asset that I have to manage, as opposed to trying to copy and paste a bunch of things and then duplicate those and try to keep those together and make a messy scene. And so in our world outliner, you can see that we've got just one asset that we can modify. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. We'll frame our camera, and I'll bring our blueprint back up. So in our blueprint, there's a couple things that I want to do to help make things a little bit easier. So if you recall here, when I drop this in, its 0 point isn't actually at the base of it. So that's the first thing that I want to fix in my blueprint. So in my viewport, I'm actually going to switch this to, say, like a right view so I can see. And I'm going to select my scene root, which is everything. And if you notice, it doesn't really give me a handle. So to change that, I can select all of these individual meshes, and I can right click, and I can, or I can just add a component, a scene component, or just by having all of these guys selected and switching my toggle from local to world, I can go in here and I can just shift these guys up. So there we go. We can see the origin point. I'll compile, and if we go back in, you can see now when I drag them in, it's no longer going through the floor. So go ahead and delete this guy. Since we already have one in our scene, we'll move him back down. Excuse me. And then, so let's go ahead and organize this just a little bit better. So I'm going to go back to my perspective. And to do this, I'm going to select my lights. I'm going to do add component scene over that. And I'm going to call these lights. We'll go ahead and click drag this onto the share root, say attach, there we go. Move these guys, same thing, we'll move these down as well. And for naming sake, let's make these a little bit easier, because when we put these into our blueprint script, it'd be easier to know kind of what we're dealing with. So this light component 1, I'm gonna go ahead and go into the variable name and just call this lower light. Go to my upper one, and same thing, I will just call this upper light. Now, if you decide to change any of these names after you've created your construction script, that's totally fine. It will automatically update the script as needed. Okay, so I've got these components here. Same thing, I could, add these as another scene component, and I could say, backdrop. There we go. I'm actually going to move this guy back up here. So make new root. We'll select these guys. Oops, actually, what I needed to do was attach, not make new root. There we go, backdrop. So our backdrop's there, and then we can name the rest of these, which is totally fine. Because we're going to just be doing a bulk material selection on these, it's totally fine, we can keep these there. But that's just a way to help you with organization later on. The critical components are going to be our lower light and our upper light. So I'll go ahead and compile, and we will save this. So, okay, so now we've got a little bit of organization. What I want to do is go in and actually start putting our logic in. So let's start that process. So before we begin the process of actually going in and adding our variables, it's important to know where are these variables going to show up. So I'm back in my viewport, and I've clicked our Diorama BP, and you can see over here in the details panel, this is where we'll have those variables. And so that's what I want to expose. So that way when I drag this in there, it's easy for me to go in and add these various different components. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start adding our different components. So in our Diorama blueprint, I'm going to go over to my construction scripts. This is where I'm going to add it. The reason why we're adding it in the construction script is that we want the ability when we're in our viewport to actually see the changes that we're doing, as opposed to having to go back in, compile the blueprint, and then it shows up. So to do that in real time, that's why we need the construction blueprint. So okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drag off of this, and I'm going to add a sequence. This will make sense a little bit, but the reason why is we're going to have multiple things fire off at once. So to do this, we'll just add a sequence. Okay, so if I look over in my components over here, you can see that I've got all of my different meshes and stuff. Now, of course, you can always go back to your viewport. You can see exactly what those meshes are. But if you remember, we renamed our lights to make things a little bit easier. So I'm going to go to my construction script, and the first thing I want to do is actually just drag off these two. So I want my upper light, and I want my lower light. Now to start with, I'm actually going to do the upper light first, and then we'll kind of copy over that logic to our lower light. So to do this, I'm actually going to drag off of this pin, and the one thing that I want to be exposed in my blueprint is the ability to increase or decrease the intensity. So I can do INTEN. There we go. Set intensity under my components light. So I'll do set intensity. So now I've got my target is my upper light. I will drag off my sequence since I want this to be able to be set. And you can see here new intensity is set as a variable. Now what I can do is I can actually left click, drag off of this, and I can do promote to variable. And so I've got this new variable. Now I'm going to click this, and I'm going to say upper light intensity. There we go. Okay, now if I compile and I save this, and if we go back to our blueprint, you can see we don't actually have anything here. And that's because our variable is not exposed. So I'm going to select my upper light intensity, and I'm going to do instance editable. And then I'm going to go ahead and do compile and save. And now you can see here we have this upper light intensity. Now by default it's 0, so I can go back to this and I can say, if you recall, I think the value was 350. So this is what it is by default. Great, okay. Now one more thing that I do want to change here is you have the ability to do a little bit more organization on your blueprint. So under my upper light intensity, I want to change my category, and I'm going to say lights. There we go. Okay, so now I've got the ability in my blueprint, so if I go back over to here, to be able to set my upper light intensity, so you see if I drag this, on a per blueprint basis. So there we go, perfect. That's great, that's exactly what we're looking for. The next thing that I want to do is the ability to set the temperature. So I can drag off of this upper light again, and I can do temperature, set temperature. So there we go. We'll do this, connect up our nodes. Same thing on my new temperature. I can drag off, promote to variable, go back to my variable, and I can name this upper light temp. And by default, if you remember, I think the upper light was at 3500. So I'm going to do instance editable. We'll go ahead and compile. That will give us our default, and we'll change this to 3500. Compile and save. And now, if we go back, you can see we have our default again, upper light temp. So to change that, we'll go back into here, select our category, lights, compile, save. And now when we click our blueprint, we can see upper light intensity. We can change it here. Upper light temp, we can drag. There we go. Very, very simple. So you don't have to be a whiz programmer. I'm not a programmer myself. So that's perfect. So I'm going to go and select all these. I'm going to press C for comment, and I'm going to say upper light. So there we go. And I'll double click here to drag a point just to make things a little bit cleaner. So there we go. So that is the logic for our upper light. Now what I can do is I can select these guys, just the two nodes. You can't necessarily copy the variables because we'll change it. Press Control C, Control V. There we go. We now have our intensity. And I'm going to drag off my sequence for my second one. Set my lower light as my target, if you remember, as we did in the first one. I'll go ahead and organize this a little bit. And then same thing, I'm going to drag off of this, promote to variable. So we'll call this one now lower light intensity. There we go. We'll do instance editable. We'll compile. We'll set it by default at 350. Compile. Same thing on our temperature. Promote to variable. We'll make this instance editable. We'll call this lower light temp. There we go. Instance editable. Move this down. Compile and set our default temp at 35. I'm sorry, lower light was actually set to 9,000 Kelvin, I believe. We'll compile, we'll save, we'll select these two variables that we have here. Actually, we'll select one, change the default to lights, as you remember in the top one. We'll change this one as well to lights, compile, save, and there we go. So now we've got our upper light intensity, upper light temp, lower light intensity, lower light temp, and we can test these. So there we go, got our intensity, and we've got our temperature. And we can always reset back to the defaults. Now, that pretty much completes the basic blueprint. Now, there's one thing that I do want to set up next, and that is the material association. So if you remember, with our diorama, the reason why I kind of built this was to be able to test out materials. So, you know, in our blueprint itself, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 different meshes, all of which can have a material associated with them. And what I would like the ability to do is to expose a parameter in my blueprint that says, hey, drag one material, and I'll go ahead and assign it to the meshes that need it. So let's step through that process. All right, so now that we're back on our blueprint, one of the things I need to do is just add another sequence pin. And for this, I need to drag in all of the different materials or different assets that I want materials to be assigned to. Now, if you notice that if I select, for example, our sphere, it has only one material slot available to it. But if I click on our kind of cloth thing, you'll notice that we have 2. And the reason for that is the way that this particular asset was set up is the element 0 is actually the cloth, and then element 1 are kind of our pipes. So I want our pipes to have their own unique material, but the cloth to have its own. So in order to help us make this a little bit easier to select, instead of naming it static mesh component 0, I'm going to name this our cloth drape. There we go. So it's just a little bit easier for us to know which stuff we're dealing with. So I'll compile and I'll save. And I think that should be it. In fact, actually, let's do a little bit more organization because I really don't want to change the materials on my lights. So I'll say, you know, light bar 1. And then I'll look for our second light bar, which should be right here. So there we go. So we'll go light bar 2. Okay, so now we know which components we want to use. So I'm going to jump back to our construction script. And the first thing that I want to do is actually select all of those components that I want to change the material on. So I'll select all these guys. I just control click those, drag these in. And now we have all of our different meshes that will change our materials on. So I'm just going to drag off one of these guys, and I'm going to type in set material. So I'm going to do this set material, and that is our target. So I'll drag off of our pin so it does actually process in this when we do this. And here's the cool part. So I'm going to set the material on one of them. I can simply just click all of these guys, drag them into my target, and it will set the material on those guys as well. Now, if you remember, I'll jump back here to our viewport, click our cloth drape. We have two materials, so element 0, element 1. Now, element 0 is the one that we want for our cloth. So if I go back to my construction script, you can see here, underneath my set material node, I've got an element index of 0. So I can take this guy, I'm going to copy and duplicate it, and under this one, set material index of 1. And I'll drag this cloth drape as well. And there we go. So this should process, and then we'll go ahead and actually do this one. We'll do set material. Okay, there we go. So that's our material setting. So we'll compile. We'll see if we can click here. We'll go back to our blueprint and double check. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we have the ability to set our material exposed in our blueprint, right? Because we can't actually select it now. So let's do that process right now. All right, so now that we're in our blueprint and we have all the different meshes that we want to set the material on, the thing that we need to do is we need to actually create a variable for us to set the material. Right now, the way this is set up is that if I were to assign a material in this slot, that would apply all the time. I don't want that. I want a variable. So I'm going to left-click drag off this material. And I'm going to say promote to variable. So in here, I'm just going to call this variable material. There we go. We'll compile. And then by default, you can have a material in there. I'm just going to leave it blank so that way it indicates, hey, I need to change my material. But the other thing I want to do is say instance editable. So I'll compile. And you can see now we have this material slot. Now I can put it in a category called materials. I'll leave it in for default by now. And that's it. So let's go ahead and save this. And you can see now we have our blueprint. Let me go up and just do an instance of this. So I'll take a material that I've got, I'll drag it in, and you can see now that it applies to every single one of my meshes. That's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for and exactly what we needed. So I can take this blueprint, I can duplicate them, I could go back in, set a new material, and as you can see, it's on a per instance basis, so I could have multiple materials, set my one material, and change my lights. So if we review real quick on how we set this up, so we dragged everything into our blueprint. We have all of our assets, we've named them just for simplicity, and in our construction script, we run through on our sequence, just setting the intensity. We have our variables where they have instance editable exposed, and our default values as well. We set that for both our upper and our lower light. And then for materials, by simply dragging in our different components, setting our material, and then actually dragging off from material, creating our variable, and again, exposing that on instance editable, and that's it. That gives us the ability now to go in and create kind of a fun little diorama that's really easy to use and quickly change the materials on. So very straightforward. I think it should be easy for all the artists out there that aren't necessarily super savvy with programming or blueprints, but a fun little way to do a diorama that you can use over and over again and make your life a little bit easier. So I hope this was kind of fun, easy to follow, and as always, I appreciate your guys' support. Leave a comment. I do read those if you've got suggestions for future videos. But until then, I'll catch you on the next one.